Georges St-Pierre, once hailed as the greatest fighter in UFC history, is now 44 years old, and things have taken a tragic turn. Behind the glory, the championships, and the image of a perfect athlete lies a much darker reality. Rumors of health struggles, crippling anxiety, and isolation paint a picture far from the hero fans remember. The man who once carried the UFC on his back is now fighting battles few ever see. In this video, we'll reveal everything: his rise, his glory, and the heartbreaking truth of how life has become tragic for Georges St-Pierre today. To understand why Georges St-Pierre's life at 44 feels so tragic, you have to go back to his beginnings in Saint-Isidore, Quebec. Born in 1981, he grew up in a small, quiet town, but his childhood was anything but peaceful. Georges was bullied relentlessly. Older kids would wait for him outside of school, stealing his belongings, beating him up, even taking his bicycle. Those early years left scars. He later admitted that the fear he felt as a child shaped everything that came after. "I was afraid all the time. That's why I learned to fight." At 7 years old, his father enrolled him in Kyokushin karate. Martial arts became more than just self-defense. It was his refuge, a way to regain the confidence that bullies stripped away. He trained obsessively, throwing himself into discipline and structure, chasing control in a world where he once felt powerless. Soon, he added wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and boxing to his arsenal. While other kids played, Georges was training, building the foundation for one of the most complete mixed martial artists in history. But the path wasn't easy. His family wasn't wealthy. His father worked multiple jobs to keep things afloat. Georges himself took janitorial shifts to pay for gym memberships and equipment. He would mop floors during the day, then spar at night, dreaming of making it to the UFC, a league most Canadians had never even heard of at the time. To many, it seemed like an impossible dream. But Georges had something his peers didn't: the trauma of a childhood spent powerless, and the hunger to make sure he never felt that way again. By the early 2000s, GSP was already dominating the Canadian fight scene, earning a reputation for his discipline and calm under pressure. In 2004, at just 23 years old, he made his UFC debut against Karo Parisyan. The win put him on the map instantly. Fans were drawn to his humility, his thick French-Canadian accent, and his almost robotic focus. He wasn't a trash talker, he wasn't flamboyant, he was the opposite of what the UFC usually marketed. And that's what made him unique. He was real, authentic, and deadly. Yet even as he rose, the shadows of his past lingered. The same bullying that made him tough also planted seeds of anxiety that never left him. Georges himself admitted in later years that the fear of failure and the haunting memories of his youth never truly disappeared. They simply transformed into fuel. And while that fuel carried him to greatness, it also laid the foundation for the tragic struggles he would face later in life. Georges St-Pierre's rise in the UFC was fast, spectacular, and relentless. He was a fighter who didn't just win, he evolved in front of fans' eyes. After beating Karo Parisyan, he soon faced Matt Hughes, the reigning welterweight champion and one of the most dominant grapplers in UFC history. At UFC 50 in 2004, the young GSP looked strong early, but was caught in an armbar and forced to tap. He admitted afterward that he idolized Hughes and entered the cage already intimidated. It was a harsh lesson, but one that lit a fire in him. Determined to improve, GSP went back to the gym and sharpened every weapon in his arsenal. He dominated Frank Trigg, Sean Shirk, and BJ Penn, showing a level of versatility few had ever seen. When he got his rematch with Hughes in 2006, he didn't just win, he destroyed him, knocking Hughes out with a head kick to capture the welterweight title. In that moment, Georges wasn't just a fighter anymore. He was a champion. Canada erupted in celebration. The UFC had its first Canadian superstar, and he was humble, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective. But the pressure came quickly. In his first title defense against Matt Serra in 2007, Georges suffered one of the biggest upsets in MMA history. Serra landed a looping right hand that wobbled him, and seconds later the referee stopped the fight as GSP was pounded on the mat. The loss devastated him. He admitted later he underestimated Serra, overlooking him as an easy opponent. That defeat haunted him deeply. For most fighters, a loss like that might have broken their spirit. For Georges, it became a turning point. He rebuilt himself from the ground up, refining his wrestling, perfecting his jab, and adopting a new mental approach. By 2008, he reclaimed the belt and began a dominant run that would last for years. He avenged his loss to Serra in brutal fashion, then went on to defend the welterweight title against legends like BJ Penn, John Fitch, Dan Hardy, Josh Koscheck, and Carlos Condit. His dominance wasn't just in winning, it was in how little his opponents could touch him. Fight after fight, Georges dismantled elite fighters while barely taking damage himself. But behind the calm, the suit and tie demeanor, and the champion's smile was something darker. Georges admitted later that the pressure of being a champion weighed heavily on him. He developed insomnia, panic attacks, and an obsessive fear of losing. Every fight camp was torture, mentally, not just physically. "I didn't enjoy it," he later revealed. "I was afraid every time." Fans saw the perfect athlete, the untouchable champion. But Georges was quietly cracking under the weight of expectations. And though he kept winning, each victory pushed him closer to a breaking point that even he couldn't ignore forever. By 2008, Georges St-Pierre had transformed from a young Canadian prospect into a dominant world champion. He wasn't just winning fights, he was doing it with such precision and control that opponents seemed powerless against him. His rematch with BJ Penn in 2009 showcased this perfectly. GSP broke Penn down systematically over 4 rounds until the Hawaiian legend's corner threw in the towel. From that moment, Georges was no longer just another champion. He was the face of the UFC's new era. But being at the top came with a price. Every fight became an event. Every opponent wanted to be the one to topple the king. GSP admitted that the pressure was overwhelming. While fans saw calmness in his eyes during walkouts, inside he was racked with fear and anxiety. He later confessed to panic attacks before fights and an almost crippling sense of dread in the locker room. "People think I'm confident," he said, "but I am terrified before every fight. The fear is always there." His dominance inside the cage disguised how much he was suffering outside of it. Injuries piled up. In 2011, he tore his ACL in training, a devastating injury that required surgery and months of recovery. At the time, ACL tears were often career-ending for athletes. For GSP, it was another battle in a war that never seemed to end. He returned in 2012 to unify his title against Carlos Condit. But even in victory, fans noticed he looked slower, more cautious, and perhaps more human than before. And then there was the paranoia. Georges became increasingly vocal about his suspicions of performance-enhancing drug use in the UFC. He pushed for stricter testing, calling out the system publicly. Dana White, the UFC president, bristled at his comments, insisting the sport was clean. Behind the scenes, Georges felt like a target, caught between fans who demanded perfection, an organization that didn't want him questioning its image, and opponents who were stronger, faster, and more dangerous than ever. He won fight after fight: Josh Koscheck, Jake Shields, Nick Diaz, but each victory seemed to drain him more than it fulfilled him. Fans celebrated his dominance, but Georges wasn't celebrating with them. He was quietly unraveling. The same discipline and obsessive nature that made him great was turning into a prison. He couldn't relax, couldn't stop training, couldn't find peace. His body ached, his mind raced, and his fear of failure grew heavier with each defense. By the time he fought Johnny Hendricks in 2013, the weight of it all had become unbearable. He was still winning, but inside, Georges was collapsing under the champion's burden. UFC 167 in November 2013 was supposed to be just another chapter in Georges St-Pierre's legendary reign. Instead, it became one of the most controversial nights in MMA history. Facing Johnny Hendricks, a younger, stronger, and hungry challenger, GSP took a beating unlike any other in his career. Hendricks battered him with heavy shots, bruising his face and swelling his eyes. Many fans, analysts, and even UFC President Dana White believed Hendricks had won. But when the judge's decision was read, GSP's hand was raised. The win preserved his title, but the aftermath was chaos. At the post-fight press conference, Georges shocked the world. With his face bruised and his voice trembling, he announced that he was stepping away from the sport. He didn't call it a retirement, but it was clear he was done. For now, Dana White was furious, claiming Georges owed Hendricks a rematch and blasting him publicly for walking away. Fans were confused. Why would the greatest fighter in the world, still champion, still at the top, leave the sport? Georges later explained that the decision wasn't about Hendricks or fear of losing, it was about survival. The pressure had broken him. Years of insomnia, anxiety, paranoia about steroids, and the crushing burden of carrying the UFC had left him mentally shattered. "I was burned out," he admitted. "I needed to disappear." Behind the scenes, Georges confessed to suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder. His training routines had become compulsions. He trained not because he wanted to, but because he felt trapped. If he didn't, he feared everything would fall apart. Even in his time off, he couldn't escape. He admitted that fame made him paranoid, that he felt like a prisoner in his own life. He avoided nightclubs, stayed away from crowds, and lived with a constant sense of being watched. His body was also breaking down. Years of fights, injuries, and surgeries had left him aching daily. The ACL tear had been repaired, but his knees were never the same. His brain had absorbed years of punishment, and though he rarely showed it, the long-term effects were beginning to reveal themselves in small ways. Memory lapses, mood swings, and a lingering fear that he might suffer from CTE down the line. For fans, his decision to leave was shocking. For Georges, it was necessary. He had won everything there was to win, defended his title countless times, and etched his name into history, but at the cost of his peace, his body, and his sanity. At 32 years old, Georges St-Pierre walked away at the peak of his career, and though fans hoped it was temporary, the truth was clear. The cracks in his armor were no longer invisible. They were wide open, and the tragedy of his post-fighting life was only beginning. For 4 years, Georges St-Pierre stayed out of the cage. Fans begged for his return. Promoters speculated endlessly, but Georges kept his distance. He trained in silence, dabbled in acting roles, and tried to live a life outside of fighting. But the itch never went away. For a man who had spent his entire life under the lights, retirement felt more like exile. And by 2017, at age 36, he shocked the world by announcing his comeback. But this wasn't just any comeback. It was a leap into unknown territory. Georges was moving up a weight class to face Michael Bisping for the UFC middleweight title. On paper, it seemed insane. He had never fought at 185 pounds before, had been gone for 4 years, and was facing a champion who had just beaten Anderson Silva. Yet Georges, disciplined as always, prepared in silence, cutting no corners. The fight at UFC 217 in Madison Square Garden was electric. Fans packed the arena, eager to see if their hero still had it. From the opening bell, Georges looked sharp. Even after the long layoff, he moved with precision, controlled the pace, and in the third round, dropped Bisping with a left hook before finishing him with a rear naked choke. The crowd erupted. In that moment, Georges St-Pierre had done the impossible. He became a 2-division champion, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest fighters of all time. But even in victory, Georges was in pain. Behind the cameras, he was sick, literally. Weeks later, he revealed that he was suffering from ulcerative colitis, a chronic illness that left him weak, fatigued, and unable to keep fighting at middleweight. The weight gain had wreaked havoc on his body, and the stress of the comeback had taken more from him than it gave back. Almost as soon as he had returned, he was forced to vacate the belt and step away once again. The comeback should have been a fairy tale, the perfect ending to a legendary career. Instead, it became another haunting chapter. Georges had proven he was still the best, but the price was too high. His body broke down, and his illness forced him into silence once again. The loneliness of retirement returned, this time heavier than before. The victory was historic, but Georges himself described it as bittersweet. "I came back. I conquered, but my body couldn't handle it anymore." What fans saw as triumph, Georges experienced as another reminder of the prison he lived in. He could win fights, he could silence doubters, but he couldn't escape himself. The lonely comeback only deepened the tragedy, proof that even glory couldn't cure the darkness creeping in. By 2019, Georges St-Pierre made his retirement official. At a press conference in Montreal, he stood in front of the cameras and said the words fans had dreaded for years. "I am retiring from mixed martial arts." His voice was calm, his demeanor steady, but his eyes betrayed a deep sadness. He explained that his body was failing him, that his ulcerative colitis had made competition impossible, and that his time in the sport was over. The UFC honored him, fans cheered his career, and Georges left the stage as the greatest welterweight of all time. But retirement did not bring peace. Georges admitted that life without fighting was harder than fighting itself. "When you fight, you have purpose," he once said. "When you retire, you have nothing." For a man whose entire identity had been forged in discipline and competition, the sudden emptiness was devastating. He threw himself into other pursuits, acting in Marvel movies, coaching seminars, business ventures, but none of it filled the void. In interviews, he spoke candidly about his struggles with obsessive-compulsive disorder. He explained that his mind never stopped, that he trained compulsively not out of joy, but out of fear of losing himself. He admitted to bouts of crippling anxiety, sleepless nights, and lingering paranoia that fame had only made worse. Even wealth and legacy couldn't silence the demons. Georges had millions in the bank, global fame, and the respect of every fighter who ever entered the cage. But in quiet moments, he confessed to feeling empty. He avoided crowds, distrusted strangers, and often retreated into isolation. Fans expected to see him at UFC events, smiling and embracing the sport he helped build, but Georges preferred silence. His absence became its own haunting presence, a reminder that the champion who once seemed untouchable was struggling to hold himself together. And then there were the health concerns. Georges admitted to memory lapses, chronic pain, and fears of long-term brain trauma. Though he never confirmed CTE, the specter of it loomed over him. Years of sparring, years of wars in the cage could not simply be erased with money or fame. Each day was a battle not against opponents, but against the invisible damage left behind. Life after fighting was supposed to be peaceful. For Georges St-Pierre, it became a darker fight than any he had ever faced. A fight without an opponent, a fight without an audience, a fight that continues to this day, as the greatest fighter of his generation struggles in silence, haunted by everything the sport gave him and everything it took away. For fans, Georges St-Pierre's retirement seemed like a happy ending, a wealthy legend, respected by all, walking away on his own terms. But the reality at 44 is far darker. Georges himself has admitted that life outside the cage has been filled with isolation, fear, and relentless mental battles. The fame that once made him a Canadian hero now feels more like a prison. He has confessed in interviews that he avoids crowded places, that he doesn't trust strangers, and that fame often makes him paranoid. "People don't see the real me," he once said. "They see the champion, but I am not that man anymore." Instead of embracing the spotlight, Georges spends much of his time alone in Montreal, keeping his circle extremely small. The routines that once defined him as a disciplined champion have transformed into obsessions. Georges has spoken openly about his struggle with obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, describing how he feels compelled to train even when he doesn't want to. He spends hours in gyms, shadowboxing, grappling, running drills, not because he's preparing for a fight, but because he fears what will happen if he stops. "It's not healthy," he admitted. "It's like I cannot control it. I need to do it, or I feel I am going to lose myself." What fans once admired as discipline has become something darker, compulsion. Georges himself has admitted that retirement has only made it worse. Without the structure of fight camps or the goal of a title defense, training has become a ritual of survival. He doesn't do it for glory or even for fitness. He does it to silence the voices in his head, the fear that everything will collapse if he lets go. This isolation extends beyond training. Friends have described him as distant, hard to reach, a man who retreats into himself. He avoids social gatherings, keeps public appearances brief, and rarely lets people into his inner world. Unlike other UFC legends who remain visible as commentators, coaches, or promoters, Georges exists in the shadows, removed from the sport he once defined. For fans, the silence is confusing. For Georges, it is necessary, But beneath that silence is a haunting reality. A man who once stood in front of millions now spends much of his life fighting unseen battles in solitude. And at 44 years old, those battles are only becoming heavier. While Georges St-Pierre rarely discusses it directly, whispers about his long-term health have followed him for years. The wars he endured in the cage, the beatings from Matt Hughes, the grueling 5-round fights against John Fitch and Carlos Condit, the brutal shots absorbed from Johnny Hendricks left their mark. Even though GSP was known for his defense, no fighter walks away untouched. At public appearances in recent years, fans have noted small but telling signs. His speech, once sharp and confident, sometimes sounds slower, more deliberate. He occasionally loses his train of thought in interviews. Former training partners have mentioned that he repeats stories without realizing it or forgets conversations entirely. While Georges has never admitted to brain damage, the speculation of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, lingers. It's a dark cloud that hangs over many fighters of his era. Men like Chuck Liddell, Wanderlei Silva, and Gary Goodridge have all shown the effects of years of head trauma. Georges, who fought some of the toughest battles in UFC history, is not immune. And though he tries to maintain a healthy lifestyle, the reality of repeated concussions and years of sparring can't be undone. Physically, his struggles are just as haunting. Georges has spoken about lingering pain in his knees, the same joints that required surgery during his career. He also admitted that the ulcerative colitis he developed after his comeback against Bisping still affects him, forcing him to carefully monitor his diet and stress levels. Even his obsessive training, which he relies on for mental balance, only worsens the wear and tear on his aging body. The saddest part is that Georges knows what may be coming. He has said before that he fears the long-term consequences of fighting, fears the possibility of cognitive decline. It's why he avoids alcohol, drugs, and partying. But even with his careful lifestyle, the damage may already be there. At 44 years old, Georges St-Pierre isn't preparing for comebacks or enjoying a peaceful retirement. He's living in a fragile balance, managing chronic illness, coping with obsessive compulsions, and fearing the possibility of CTE. For the fans who once saw him as invincible, the reality is hard to accept. The greatest champion the UFC ever produced is now haunted by the sport that made him a legend.